Hello and welcome to Rajya Sabha Television. You're watching India's World with me, Frank Rausen Pereira. India and South Africa on Friday sealed a 3-year strategic program to further boost cooperation in a number of key areas after talks between Prime Minister Narendra Modi and South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. In his media statement, Prime Minister Modi said both sides discussed all aspects of the bilateral ties with an aim to further expand cooperation in diverse areas. Ramaphosa said his country was looking at a result-oriented partnership with India through implementation of the 3-year strategic exchange program. On this edition of India's World, we will analyze the warming of ties between India and South Africa. Joining me on the program today are Shiv Shankar Mukherjee, former ambassador, Sreeram Chaulia, Dean, Jindal School of International Affairs, and Major General Dhruv C. Katoch, Director, India Foundation. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on this edition of India's World. You know, Professor, the Ambassador touched upon this aspect of it, you know, the historic ties between India and South Africa. Now, that's noteworthy, isn't it? Yes,
this is the 150th anniversary of Mahatma Gandhi and the 100th of Mandela. It's just a great coincidence that these two, you know, great personalities have a round figure of 150 and 100 coinciding in the same year, 2019. So I think the Madiba-Mahatma connection, yes, we continue to emphasize that. But Frank, also even in the civilian side, you see, if you look at India's overall trade with Africa, it's on a growth trajectory. It's like nearly 70 billion US last year. And out of that, more than 10 or close to 10 is contributed only by South Africa. So South Africa is, in terms of the exchange, one of the principal pillars for India's Africa strategy, and that has to do with the history. That has to do with the migration patterns. We have nearly 1.5 million people of Indian origin in South Africa, many of whom fought against apartheid and were very close associates of Nelson Mandela. And we also want to talk about, you know, agriculture and industry, because this, you remember 2018, Frank, Prime Minister laid out our 10-point guidelines for what India wants to do in Africa. And this is a very important marker in our maturation of our Africa policy. And one of the points he said was that, you know, that we, Africa is 60% of the world's arable land, but it produces only 10% of the world's agriculture output, and we want to support enhancement of that. So a number of Indian companies are involved in, you know, taking land and for commercial farming and then exporting the produce from Africa back to India as well as to other parts of the world. Some of them have been successful companies, a few have been controversial, but overall that's one contribution. The other, of course, is with industry, I mean, and services also. You look at a company like Bharti, for example, they have 78 million subscribers in Africa, including in parts of West Africa like Ghana, Nigeria, you know, so essentially, and then you look at the Pan-African e-network and other ways by which India is connecting Africa. That's a huge contribution we're doing, and they value us a lot. And last but not least is, you come to the defense, you see the emphasis on naval cooperation. I see that it has been increased lately with South Africa. And the reason for that is obvious. One, you know, we say that we are against non-traditional threats like piracy and, you know, drug smuggling and human smuggling and those kind of things. But the unstated objective is, of course, that we want to preserve a kind of Indian Ocean that we say is free of any kind of hegemonic players. And the advancement of the People's Liberation Army Navy in this region is quite high. They have, you know, this is part of the Belt and Road for them initiative. And it's part of the maritime commons where they are increasingly, you know, muscling through. So I think it's important for us to show that we are also cognizant of the western flank of the Indian Ocean. And you see the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium and Indian Ocean Rim Association. Both of these had India and South Africa almost as co-founders. South Africa from the beginning, you know, has been wanting India to be there so as not to be falling into, you know, the lap of the Chinese, so to say, although they do have very strong, you know, Chinese connections and investments and loans as well. So I think Rwanda and South Africa, Frank, these are the two officially stated strategic partners for India in Africa. And I think we should expand it to Nigeria and to Ghana as well, which is a little further away. And then we will have a series of capable states with whom we have a strong strategic understanding. When we say strategic relations, it's different from, you know, simply having trade and commerce, right? So we are talking about defense plus trade plus people to people, and of course reforming the international institutions. South Africa is one of the contenders to have the permanent seat in the UN Security Council along with Nigeria, and we have often been coordinating with them. So you look at all of these, there's great convergence of interests.
Professor, how do both countries boost ties even further going forward?
Well, to follow from General Katoch, I would like to add, peacekeeping capacities. South Africa is trying to develop a 25,000 strong indigenous African peacekeeping force, so that they don't have to be dependent on, external forces whenever they have insurrections or rebellions or civil war type situations, which unfortunately have been quite a few in Africa. South Africa is taking the lead, and Nigeria wants to do the same for Mali and these kind of places where there is, jihadist extremist threat and so on in West Africa. So this is where, I think India, with its rich experience in peacekeeping, we need to be collaborating very closely with them to nurture and develop, their peacekeeping capabilities, especially at the level of, rank and file soldiers. And our own, we have sent thousands of peacekeepers to the African continent, and some of them have even given their lives in South Sudan and in Congo and all that. So these are all, highly appreciated by the South Africans and the Nigerians especially. So I think we need to take it forward. The other thing is, there's a new development, which is a Pan-African Continental Free Trade Area. This has been signed recently, and almost half of the AU member countries have already are on board. And this is actually reducing tariff and custom barriers across within the AU member countries.
Sure.
And so if we have a base like South Africa, where we are exporting more than to other countries, from which to pass on to Mozambique and Zambia and then go further into the continent, this is like a wonderful opportunity to enhance trade, especially our exports. And last, I will also say that, when we do capacity building, I've always been a believer that we must also have, some trained young Indians like the US Peace Corps, who would be positioned in key countries in Africa at the grassroots with the support of the Indian government, and imparting, computer skills, math, English, and all these things that will build a long-term goodwill for us at the grassroots. Right. Already there is an Indian community, especially in Kenya and Tanzania and South Africa. These are the three big hubs for us, for the diaspora. But I'm talking about Indians from here, going there on short-term basis and, living with the community, working with the community. Maybe some private corporations can also chip in and finance this kind of initiative. We need something new, apart from, already we have high-tech programs and trainings and, all kinds of things in agriculture, in irrigation, in solar electricity. There's a whole variety of these things. But what I'm suggesting is a more longer-term civilian presence there with a purpose to build our soft power in Africa further.
But what you're suggesting is build on the positives and build on what we already have on the ground, and don't take Africa for granted, is what you're suggesting. With that, it's a wrap on this edition of India as Well. Thank you to all my guests for joining me on the program and putting things into perspective for us.